If you're looking for a shortcut, a way to understand the deeper currents of the human psyche, that universal blueprint hidden just beneath your conscious mind, then you are definitely in the right place.
Mm.
Today, we are doing a deep dive into the map drawn by Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, who really stands shoulder to shoulder with Freud and Adler as one of the great architects of modern psychological thought.
And Jung's work, I mean, it's just so remarkable because it didn't just stay in the clinic.
No.
His concept, yeah, they revolutionized psychiatry, of course, but they also, they profoundly influenced anthropology, literature, philosophy, even religious studies. His output was just tremendous, over 20 books, decades of letters, and as we'll get into, some truly singular hidden works of art.
And that's our mission today. We want to give you a really thorough but concise map of Jung's central contributions. We need to pull out the ideas that took our understanding of the unconscious beyond, just a dustbin for repressed desires.
Right.
And instead established it as this vast collective, inherited reservoir of all humanity.
Exactly. And the foundation of his whole system, which he called analytical psychology, it's all centered on this one lifelong human task: individuation.
Okay, so let's unpack that. We're not just talking about being an individual, are we? It's something more.
Oh, much more. Not at all.
Right.
Individuation is the ultimate process of psychological self-fulfillment. It's the task of integrating all the separate bits of the self, the conscious and unconscious, the light and the dark, into one unified, functioning whole.
So it's a journey.
It is the journey toward wholeness. It means confronting everything we try to avoid about ourselves, and it really defines the entire Jungian project.
And as we trace that journey, we are going to meet the concepts that form his universal vocabulary of the mind.
Mm.
The collective unconscious, these foundational templates he called archetypes, the vital necessity of the shadow, and of course that detailed map of personality extroversion and introversion.
And we can't forget synchronicity.
Oh, definitely not. But to start, we really need to understand the man himself, the one who dared to draw this map, beginning with the forces that shaped him in his earliest years.
Jung's early life, back in Keswell, Switzerland, it really laid the groundwork for his lifelong obsession with duality. The separation between the visible world and the invisible world. He was born in 1875, and his home life was, well, complex.
The sources really highlight this significant split in how he saw his parents. His father, Paul, was an impoverished rural pastor. A figure of reliability, sure, but in Jung's eyes, also someone struggling with his own faith, almost intellectually powerless.
And his mother, Emily, was the complete counterpoint. Eccentric, depressed, and just deeply immersed in what you might call the spiritual or even the occult realm.
That's a huge duality to grow up with.
It's a crucial observation. Jung described her as being normal and nurturing during the day, but at night she became, in his words, strange and mysterious. He talked about her speaking of spirits visiting her room. He even claimed he saw a luminous, indefinite figure coming out of her room one night, with its head sort of detached and floating beside it.
Wow. I mean, that sounds less like a typical childhood memory and more like an early initiation into the realm of the unconscious.
Precisely. And those early impressions, they created this framework for understanding people, the daytime persona versus the nocturnal hidden reality. Initially, this led Jung to associate women with a certain innate unreliability.
And his father with stability, but also with limitation.
Right. But it's really worth noting he revised that view as he got older. He reflected that he'd been disappointed by men he trusted, but actually never by the women he had initially mistrusted. It's like he was working through his own projections, which of course informed his entire body of work on psychic balance.
And this sense of duality wasn't just external, was it? He felt it inside himself, from childhood. He called it his two personalities.
Yes, the split self. It was a fundamental part of his own development. He felt he had personality number one, which was the normal, average schoolboy, the conscious, functioning self.
The kid who does his homework.
Exactly. But then he also housed personality number two. And this was a dignified, authoritative man, someone connected to the 18th century, deeply intellectual and very close to nature. This profound sense of a fragmented psyche and the need for these two halves to somehow communicate is the direct precursor to his later theories on the persona and the shadow.
Which brings us to one of the most compelling anecdotes from his childhood.
Yeah.
The ritual of the tiny mannequin.
Oh, this is just a stunning example of his emerging theory on these deep-seated universal patterns. As a boy, Jung secretly carved a little wooden mannequin, put it inside his pencil case with a painted stone he called a soul stone, and then hid the whole sacred object up in the attic rafters.
And he would visit it, right? He'd leave these tiny, secret messages written in a private language. Why was that so important to him?
Because years later, Jung recognized that this purely intuitive ceremonial act brought him this profound inner peace and security, a connection to something bigger than himself. And when he started studying anthropology and indigenous cultures, he discovered these strikingly similar practices.
Like the totems.
Exactly, like the Churungas in Central Australia. These totems were symbolic repositories of the ancestral spirit, and they brought ritual peace. Jung realized his childhood act was an unconscious ritual, almost identical to those practiced in cultures he knew nothing about as a boy. This was proof for him that these core psychological structures, the archetypes, were universal and innate, not learned.
That comparison, a little Swiss boy hiding a carving in ancient indigenous rituals. It's the perfect illustration for the collective unconscious, long before he even had a name for it.
Absolutely. The need for ritual, for a sacred object, the striving for inner peace. He believed it's all built into the hardware of the human mind.
The path he eventually chose was medicine. Partly because his family's poverty meant he couldn't study his first choice, archaeology at the University of Basel. But by choosing psychiatry, he kind of combined both, didn't he?
He did. Psychiatry, for Jung, offered a synthesis, the scientific biological study of the brain and the deep exploration of the soul. It was exactly what his dual nature was searching for.
And he starts his career in 1900 at the Berkeley Hospital under Eugen Bleuler.
The man who coined the term schizophrenia, yeah. And Jung's dissertation was on occult phenomena, drawing on the supposed mediumship of his own cousin. So he was already pushing boundaries right from the start.
It was his research on word association, though, where a patient's emotional complexes are revealed by how they react to certain words, that got him international recognition, and inevitably brought him to the attention of Sigmund Freud.
The alliance between Jung and Freud, it started in 1907, and it was just intense, immediate, and very high stakes. The historical record says their first meeting was this marathon discussion that lasted for 13 continuous hours.
13 hours. And Freud saw more than just a talented colleague in Jung. He saw a successor, his adopted eldest son. He specifically needed Jung, right? A Christian-raised, scientifically rigorous Swiss intellectual.
He absolutely did. It was a strategic choice. Psychoanalysis at the time was being threatened by rising European anti-Semitism, and Freud and many of his closest colleagues were Jewish. Jung was seen as essential for legitimizing the movement, for making it mainstream.
So this political dimension made the partnership incredibly important to Freud.
So important that Jung became the first president of the new International Psychoanalytical Association. They cemented their collaboration with that joint trip to the U.S. in 1909 for a conference at Clark University, where they both got honorary degrees.
And that trip was significant for Jung, because he also met William James, and they connected over mysticism and spiritualism. Maybe that gave him an alternative to Freud's very staunch materialism.
It could have. But the very qualities Freud initially valued in Jung, his independence, his intellectual curiosity, soon became the seeds of their dramatic separation. The tensions really started escalating on that U.S. trip, especially around their private analyses of each other's dreams.
The divergence really hit its peak around 1912, though, with Jung's book Psychology of the Unconscious. And the conflict wasn't just personal, it was. It was a fundamental, irreconcilable difference in how they saw the mind.
That's the core of it. What fundamentally was the conflict?
Well, Freud insisted that the libido, which he defined primarily as sexual energy, was the one single driving force behind everything.
Right. All psychic energy, all personality formation. But Jung just profoundly disagreed. He saw the libido as a much broader, more generalized life force. And crucially, he started de-emphasizing infantile sexuality and shifting his focus to his own great discovery, the collective unconscious.
So just to be clear for everyone listening, Jung accepted Freud's model of the unconscious, but he sort of demoted it. He called it the personal unconscious.
Yes, exactly. That was the repository of an individual's own repressed or forgotten material. He basically said Freud's map was incomplete. He found Freud's model too negative, too narrow. By introducing the collective unconscious, this structural, inherited layer of the psyche Jung completely shattered the Freudian framework.
And that was the scientific declaration of war. What followed were the painful personal slights, like the infamous Kreuzlingen gesture.
The relationship just became too fraught. The Kreuzlingen gesture was the breaking point. Jung felt severely slighted after Freud visited a colleague nearby without stopping to see him in Zurich. It just confirmed for Jung that he was being deliberately excluded and minimized.
That rejection, both personal and professional, ended everything. Their last personal meeting was in Munich in 1913. Jung later said that publishing his book had cost me my friendship with Freud. But that cost was also the birth price of analytical psychology.
The great separation was complete, and Jung was left standing totally alone, forced to either abandon his ideas or confront their full and frankly terrifying implications.
That separation from Freud led directly to what some observers have called a creative illness. This wasn't just a professional disagreement, it was a profound existential crisis for Jung.
It really was. I mean, imagine losing your mentor, your entire scientific community, and the structure of your field all at once. Jung described it as a resounding censure. He felt dangerously close to what he called suicidal psychosis, or doing a schizophrenia. His world had just shattered, and he was forced to turn inward.
But instead of running from it, he embraced the collapse. He intentionally initiated his own descent into the unconscious. He called the process active imagination.
And this wasn't just, writing in a diary. This was an active confrontation with the psychic figures that were emerging from his own unconscious. For 16 years, roughly from 1913 until about 1932, Jung meticulously documented all of these visions, these conversations, these symbolic images.
He first recorded them in a series of private journals called his Black Books. And then he transcribed and illustrated all of this intensely personal material into one massive red leather-bound manuscript.
That manuscript is the Red Book, or Liber Novus, the New Book. And it is a truly singular artifact in the history of psychology. It's huge, intricately illustrated, and written in this beautiful calligraphic script.
The significance of this period just can't be overstated. It was during this time of intense inner confrontation, talking to figures like Philemon, the wise old man, who became his spiritual guide, that Jung developed his principal world-changing theories.
Yes, the archetypes, the collective unconscious, the roadmap for individuation, all of these concepts were forged in the fire of his own psychic near breakdown.
It's the ultimate example of the physician healing himself by confronting his own shadow.
Absolutely. And the secrecy around the Red Book just amplifies its importance. For decades, it was basically a rumor, a psychological myth. Fewer than 24 people ever saw it before his family finally allowed it to be published in 2009, a full 48 years after his death.
That delay, that secrecy, it just underscores how personal, or maybe how dangerous, Jung considered this material to be. When it was finally published, reviewers used words like bombastic, baroque, and a willful oddity.
And it is an unusual manuscript. It's not just prose. 2/3 of the pages bear Jung's own intricate, beautiful, and sometimes pretty terrifying illustrations. It's a work of art, a religious text, and a scientific journal all rolled into one. It just shows that for Jung, the boundary between the artistic, the spiritual, and the analytical mind was completely fluid.
We should probably briefly note the real-world interruption to this intense period of isolation. His service during World War I.
Yeah, despite all his inner turmoil, he served as an army doctor in neutral Switzerland. He was appointed commandant of an internment camp for British officers, and he actually dedicated himself to improving their morale, encouraging them to attend university courses to use their time productively.
A brief period where personality number 1 had to take over.
Right, the practical man had to step up, even as the deep inner work of personality number 2 continued in the background.
So emerging from this period of creative illness and publishing his book Psychological Types in 1921, Jung really solidifies his separation from Freud and enters his most productive phase. Now we get to the actual map he charted, starting again with a final destination. Individuation.
Right. Individuation is the ultimate purpose. It's the lifelong process of becoming whole, of integrating the conscious ego with the totality of the unconscious.
To really get this, we need to clarify two terms that people often mix up: the ego and the self.
Okay, so the ego is the center of consciousness. It's the I, the part of you that thinks, that perceives, that directs your will. It's what allows you to function in the world and make decisions. The problem is the ego tends to believe it's the whole show.
And the self.
The self is the totality of the psyche, the whole being. It encompasses both the conscious ego and the vast unknown collective unconscious. Individuation is the process where the ego finally recognizes it's just a satellite, not the central sun. It has to surrender its sense of primacy to the self.
Which is why the journey is so hard. It demands the ego abandons its illusion of total control and faces everything it's repressed.
Exactly. And that sets the philosophical tone. Now we can tackle the structural key that unlocks all of this. The collective unconscious. This is the idea that broke his friendship with Freud.
This is the absolute key distinction, isn't it?
It is. As we said, the Freudian personal unconscious only contains stuff that was once conscious memories, repressed wishes, forgotten things. The collective unconscious is fundamentally different. Its contents were never naturally conscious in an individual's life. It is not acquired, it is inherited.
So it's not our personal junk. It's ancestral programming.
Precisely. It consists of universal, heritable elements common to all humans, regardless of culture or personal history. Jung argued that this idea is no more daring than assuming the existence of instincts.
Right. Just like we're born with physical instincts, we're born with psychic instincts.
Exactly. This reservoir is built on archaic, subcortical brain systems, these ancient evolutionary layers in our psyche that represent the common biological and psychological history of our entire species.
And the actual units that populate this reservoir are the archetypes. If the collective unconscious is the ocean, then the archetypes are the currents and whirlpools in that ocean.
That is a fantastic analogy. Archetypes are the pre-existent forms within the collective unconscious. They're universal, recurring mental images or motifs, these potential configurations that structure human experience. They aren't specific images themselves, but they are the powerful templates that give rise to repeating experiences and symbols.
Like the archetype of the mother doesn't mean a specific mother, but the universal human experience of nurturing or birth or protection.
Exactly. And the evidence for them is empirical. You can deduce them from repeating patterns in myths, fairy tales, literature, religion, art across tens of thousands of years all over the globe. The hero, the wise old man, the shadow, the great mother, the trickster. These aren't learned ideas. They are universal programs we are born with.
To make this idea of the archetype more concrete, we should probably bring in that famous example Jung always used, the scarab beetle.
Ah, yes. This is the perfect example of how that universal form, the archetype, can manifest in the real world. Jung was treating a young, very intellectual patient who was resistant to any kind of psychological insight. She had a dream involving a golden scarab beetle.
And at that exact moment, as she's describing the dream.
At that very moment, Jung hears a tapping on the window. He opens it, and a large gold-green scarab-like beetle flies into the room.
The actual insect entering the room at the precise moment she's describing it in her dream. And the scarab was a central symbol of rebirth in ancient Egyptian mythology.
Right. Now, Jung was quick to point out that biologically it wasn't a true scarab, it was a rose chafer, but that was irrelevant. What mattered was the meaningful coincidence, the psychological impact of the universal symbol manifesting in physical reality. It completely broke the patient's resistance and allowed the therapy to finally progress.
That perfectly illustrates why he defines synchronicity as a causal connecting principle. It's not cause and effect. It's an intense, non-causal meaning connecting an inner state with an outer event.
And moving from the archetype to the mechanisms we use to interact with them, let's talk about the persona and the shadow. They represent the conscious self and the repressed self, and balancing them is fundamental to individuation.
The persona is the mask we wear.
Yes, from the Latin for an actor's mask. It's the social facade we construct. It's a compromise between the individual and society about what a man should appear to be. And we need a persona. It allows us to function socially and professionally. But if you over-identify with that role, you become shallow, alienated from your true nature. You risk becoming just a walking persona.
And if the persona is the face we present to the world, the shadow is the mirror image. Everything the ego refuses to acknowledge about itself.
The shadow is the repressed, unknown part of the personality. It includes all the unacceptable weaknesses, instincts, and desires. It's the dark brother or sister we keep locked in the basement of our mind. Critically, though, the shadow also contains undeveloped positive qualities that the ego, for whatever reason, has neglected.
That's such an essential point. The shadow isn't purely evil, it's unintegrated potential.
Absolutely. Jung stressed that the shadow is vital because where there is light, there must also be shadow. Repressing the shadow makes the persona rigid and leads directly to psychological projection. That mechanism where we hate or fear or get obsessed with qualities in other people that are actually repressed parts of ourselves.
So the core of growth is confronting and integrating the shadow.
And transforming it from an adversary into a source of vitality and energy, yes.
Okay, now we have to move to perhaps the most influential, yet often misunderstood, part of Jung's mapping project, the psychological types. We all know extroversion and introversion, but Jung's typology goes so much deeper than just sociability.
Yes, much deeper. Jung was among the first to define these as fundamental attitudes, based on the direction of psychic energy. He saw the introvert as focusing energy inward, toward the internal world of reflection, dreaming, vision. The introvert interprets the world subjectively.
And the extrovert focuses energy outward toward the objective world.
Right. The extrovert is concerned with objects, sensory perception, action. They interpret the world objectively. For Jung, this was a fundamental orientation of the psyche, not just, whether you enjoy parties.
But the critical layer here, the one people often miss, is the four functions of consciousness. Without these, you don't get the full map.
That is the technical core of his book, Psychological Types. Jung proposed that everyone uses four fundamental psychological functions, but we have a natural preference for one or two. They're divided into two pairs, the rational or judging functions and the irrational or perceiving functions.
Let's define the rational ones first, thinking and feeling.
Okay, so thinking is the function of intellectual judgment. It tries to understand the world through logic, objective truth, and analysis. Is something true or false? Feeling, on the other hand, is the function of valuation. It assesses the world through subjective value, harmony, emotional weight. Is something good or bad, valuable or worthless? And importantly, for Jung, feeling is a rational process of judgment, not just a burst of emotion.
Okay, and the irrational or perceiving functions, sensation and intuition.
Right, these are the perceiving functions. Sensation is focused on perception through the five senses. It's grounded in concrete reality, what is present, tangible, observable, what is it? Intuition is focused on possibilities and potentials. Perception via the unconscious, seeking the essence and meaning of things beyond the immediate reality. What could it become?
So if you combine the two attitudes, introversion and extroversion, with these four functions, you get 8 fundamental psychological types.
Exactly. For instance, an introverted intuitive person is focused on the inner world and perceives via future possibilities. They're often visionary, but might be detached from physical reality. An extroverted sensing person is focused on the outer world and perceives through concrete, immediate physical experience, making them very action-oriented and grounded.
And the key to psychic tension is the dynamic between our dominant function and our inferior one.
Oh, absolutely vital. The function you rely on most, your dominant function, has an opposite, inferior function that lives almost entirely in your unconscious, often tied up with the shadow. For example, if your dominant function is extroverted thinking, logical, objective judgment, your inferior function will be introverted feeling, subjective, inner valuation. And it will remain childish, unintegrated, and prone to irrational outbursts.
So the ultimate goal of individuation is not just integrating the persona and the shadow, but also integrating those inferior functions to achieve a more balanced approach to life. And this, of course, is the foundation for things like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which we'll get to. Jung's framework really expanded far beyond conventional psychology, stretching into what many would consider the esoteric, the spiritual, and the philosophical. Let's start with one of his most powerful legacies, his indirect role in forming Alcoholics Anonymous.
This history gives you the clearest insight into Jung's conviction that human life has a spiritual purpose. He believed that purely material goals would inevitably lead to psychological malaise, a midlife crisis. He insisted that a genuine spiritual experience was essential for psychic health.
And this wasn't just an abstract belief. It played out directly in his treatment of a man named Roland Hazard III, a man with chronic alcoholism back around 1926.
Hazard was a desperate case. Jung had treated him with all the conventional therapies available, and nothing worked. Eventually, Jung told him that his condition was medically hopeless and that the only remaining path was a vital spiritual or religious experience, a complete ego transformation, which he admitted he, as a scientist, could not induce.
So Hazard follows that advice. He finds a conversion experience through something called the Oxford Group, and he subsequently helps his friend, Ebby Thatcher, get sober using the same spiritual principles.
And Thatcher, in turn, passes these ideas to Bill W., who, along with Dr. Bob, founded Alcoholics Anonymous in 1935. The entire 12-step movement has its roots in this single, life-changing therapeutic prescription from Jung.
Jung later crystallized this whole insight in a letter to Bill W. in 1961. He said that Hazard's craving for alcohol was the equivalent of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, and he provided the ultimate formula for recovery. Spiritus contra spiritum.
That phrase is just so potent. Spiritus in Latin means both alcoholic spirit and the religious spirit. Jung saw that the craving for alcohol was really a misdirected spiritual quest, a search for transcendence that was being tragically fulfilled by a toxic substitute. The cure, therefore, had to be the religious spirit against the alcoholic spirit.
Moving from the spiritual quest to the strange connections in the universe, let's circle back to synchronicity, that a causal connecting principle we saw with the scarab beetle.
Jung's interest in the paranormal was lifelong. He attended seances, he claimed to have witnessed parapsychic phenomena. Synchronicity, meaningful coincidence, was his attempt to provide a psychological framework for these things. It suggests there's some inherent connection or meaning between our psychic states and external events that can't be explained by linear cause and effect.
And this seemingly mystical idea actually drew him into collaboration with the world of hard physics.
It did. He heavily influenced and corresponded with the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli. Pauli was grappling with the philosophical side of quantum mechanics, non-causal events, and the observer's role. Together, they developed the concept of unus mundus.
The one world.
The one world, yeah. Suggesting that matter and psyche are fundamentally connected at some deep, unified level, and synchronicity is just a manifestation of that unity.
Another area he dove into really deeply, especially after 1928, was alchemy. Why was he so captivated by this ancient proto-science of turning lead into gold?
Jung realized that the alchemists, while they thought they were just doing chemistry, were also unconsciously projecting their own psychological transformations onto the material they were working with. He saw the whole alchemical process transforming impure material, lead, into perfected material, gold, as a perfect metaphor for the individuation process.
So the complex stages of alchemy perfectly mirrored the stages of psychological growth he had already outlined in the Red Book.
Precisely. You have the nigredo, the blackening, which represents confronting the shadow, that initial state of chaos. Then the albedo, the whitening, where consciousness begins to differentiate and achieve clarity. And finally, the rubedo, the reddening, which is the ultimate union of opposites, the sacred marriage of the conscious and the unconscious. His last major work, Mysterium Conjunctionis, was almost entirely about this theme.
Now, we have to address the most complicated and contentious area of Jung's life: his political context, his views on the state, and the highly charged controversy around Nazism and anti-Semitism. The standard for this deep dive is always impartial reporting, so we have to detail the conflicting evidence here.
It is essential to approach this with clarity. First, Jung's general political philosophy was pretty consistent. He was deeply critical of the modern state. He called the state a form of slavery, a quasi-animate personality that gets manipulated by power-hungry people.
And he argued that the state dangerously swallowed up people's religious forces.
Yes, making it comparable to a religion itself, using parades and banners and nationalistic fervor in the same way religion uses symbols to organize collective energy.
That general critique is one thing, but his specific statements about race and the German unconscious in the 1930s are far more problematic and demand we look at them directly.
Indeed. We have to cite the problematic quote from his 1934 article in the Zentralblatt, the journal he was editing. He wrote, "The Aryan unconscious has a greater potential than the Jewish unconscious." He also stated that the Jew, who is something of a nomad, has never yet created a cultural form of his own, and as far as we can see, never will. These statements are rightly viewed as highly disturbing and, according to some scholars, suggest a form of anti-Semitism was fundamental to his thinking at that time.
However, the sources also detail his defensive actions and attempts to mitigate the damage once he took on a leadership role.
Right. In 1933, Jung became president of the International General Medical Society for Psychotherapy. When the German affiliate, which was run by a cousin of Hermann Göring, excluded Jewish members, Jung actively intervened. He highlighted a provision in the International Society's constitution that allowed individual doctors, and this is crucial, including German Jewish doctors, to join the international body directly, bypassing the German affiliate's racist rule.
He defended this by claiming his goal was just to protect the continuity of a young and insecure science during an earthquake, suggesting it was a strategic maneuver, not an ideological agreement.
And this complexity continued. He later explicitly denounced Hitler. In 1936, he described Hitler as one man who is obviously possessed by forces he couldn't control, leading a whole nation toward perdition. By 1938, he described Hitler not as an individual, but as an entire nation and the double of a real person, a metaphor for the unchecked shadow of the German collective. He vehemently denied any Nazi sympathy in later interviews.
But maybe the most tangible evidence of his anti-Nazi stance came during World War II, when he provided services to the Allied cause.
That's correct. He was in direct contact with Alan Dulles, who would later head the CIA, but was then with the OSS in Switzerland. Jung provided invaluable intelligence on the psychological condition of Hitler and other key Nazi figures. Doles referred to Jung as Agent 488 and later said that nobody will probably ever know how much Professor Jung contributed to the Allied cause during the war.
It just paints a picture of a brilliant, complicated, and at times a very flawed man operating in a profoundly chaotic political landscape. From espionage to the inner map of the mind, Jung's pervasive pop culture legacy really continues today.
Well, the most immediate legacy, though it's academically debated, is the influence on psychometric instruments. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI, and socionics. Though they've been criticized by some academic psychologists as pseudoscience, they were developed directly from his model of psychological types.
And beyond assessment tools, his ideas became this incredibly fertile ground for art and music. You see in Jackson Pollock, who underwent Jungian psychotherapy. The psychoanalytic drawings that resulted are just filled with archetypal symbols.
And in music, David Bowie was a self-described Jungian. He deeply explored duality and the unintegrated self in albums like Aladdin Sane, a play on Aladdin Sane, and songs like Shadow Man. The Police were so influenced by synchronicity, they named their final album after it.
The influence is absolutely contemporary, too. The global K-pop phenomenon BTS used Jungian concepts like persona, shadow, and ego as the entire framework for their Map of the Soul album series.
It's proof that his concepts are perfectly suited for exploring duality and identity in modern media. In cinema, you get explicit references, like that infamous scene in Full Metal Jacket where the soldier explains the duality of man and calls it the Jungian thing.
And Pixar even paid homage in the film Soul, with a character called Soul Carl Jung. In the gaming world, the influence is explicit and deep. The Persona series is entirely based on his theories. Games like Alan Wake and Control also draw heavily on synchronicity and the collective unconscious.
He just provided this rich, universal vocabulary for understanding human existence, one that resonates across ancient myths, psychological theory, and modern media because it addresses these fundamental, inherited truths about who we all are. Hashtag, outro.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We started with a complex, divided childhood that drove a man to challenge the greatest psychological mind of his time and ultimately to chart the inner terrain of humanity.
Jung's essential contribution was moving beyond the confines of an individual's neuroses, beyond their personal history, to map the collective psyche, that heritable universal layer of human experience. He didn't just label parts of the mind. He provided a dynamic system with tools like the archetypes, the persona, the shadow, all guiding the individual toward wholeness.
That arduous process of individuation. And that journey toward wholeness, as he discovered with Roland Hazard, often requires a deep confrontation with the self, a vital spiritual experience, giving us that profound formula for transformation. Spiritus contra spiritum.
And Jung, despite his complexity and his controversial moments, was fundamentally an evolutionary thinker. He believed the collective unconscious was built upon these archaic, subcortical brain systems, the primitive layers in our psyche.
And here's where it connects to the cutting edge of today. Modern neuroscience and research, particularly involving psychedelics, are, in a sense, validating this archaeological view of the mind that Jung pioneered through his confrontation with the Red Book.
That's right. Research shows that certain compounds can lay bare a level of the unconscious that is otherwise accessible only under peculiar psychic conditions. Neuroimaging from these deep transformative states shows reduced activity in the brain's default mode network and this experience of archetypal unity, of ego dissolution. It points directly toward the archaic core in the self that Jung described decades ago.
So if modern science is validating that this archaic core of the psyche can be accessed, and that the ego has to temporarily dissolve for the self to emerge, a process Jung defined as individuation, what profound new paths might this open for self-discovery and integration? Paths that Jung pioneered during his own solitary confrontation.
The integration of the archaic unconscious with consciousness, what Jung called individuation, it's becoming increasingly relevant to modern psychological and spiritual practices. So you have to ask yourself, in your own journey toward wholeness, what are the modern equivalents of the alchemist's stages? What are the shadows that you are projecting onto the world around you? And what does it truly mean for you to pursue spiritus contra spiritum in your own life, to seek genuine wholeness over any toxic substitute?
A compelling question to consider as you reflect on the deep, universal structures that lie just beneath your own individual experience. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.